Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Kyo Kim. As North Korea prepares for the founding anniversary of the Workers' Party next month, there has been speculation that North Korea could undertake provocations using its new strategic weapons. And it is speculated that North Korea could test fire a submarine-launched ballistic missile on that occasion. Today, we'll discuss the implications of North Korea's possible military activities. Joining us is Frank senior expert on North Korea at the United States Institute of Peace. He worked at the Department of Defense, advising 4 different secretaries of defense on issues related to the Korean Peninsula. Gordon Chang also joins us today. He's a lawyer and the author of The Coming Collapse of China and Nuclear Showdown, North Korea Takes on the World. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
South Korea's Joint Chief of Staff Chairman nominee Won In-cheol assessed North Korea could test fire on Slbm around October 10th. How do you see the possibility? Mr. Can I start with you?
So I think there have been some conflicting assessments on this issue. Chairman Won believes an Slbm test is possible. There's also been a prominent U.S. think tank that agrees based on some satellite imagery of the Shimpo shipyard. And even there's some reporting on the ground from North Koreans about some heightened activity at Shimpo. On the other hand, Defense Minister Seo said that he saw no signs of an Slbm test. And USFK Commander Robert Abrams also said that he hasn't seen any signs of a provocation. So I think the bigger point here is that North Korea, whether now or in the future, is continuing to develop its nuclear and ballistic missile capabilities because both sides are locked in this diplomatic stalemate and can't seem to make any progress on reducing tensions on the Korean Peninsula. So I think both sides need to adopt a more realistic and flexible approach to diplomacy. And this is going to require some reciprocal concessions on both sides.
Mm-hmm. Let me turn to you, Mr. Chang. If North Korea indeed test fires on Slbm, what would be the significance of this?
Well, the significance as we just heard, that North Korea is making fast progress on being able to threaten the international community and specifically the United States. And throughout this process during the Trump administration, and indeed throughout the Bush and Obama administrations before it, North Korea has continually developed both its nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. So whatever the United States has been doing obviously has not been enough. And although I think that we should talk to the North Koreans, the more important thing is that we create the conditions for which they would agree to what we want. And by that, I mean that we start to vigorously impose the sanctions, not only against North Korea, but also China as well. A lot of the lifeline for the North Korean regime goes through Chinese banks. And we have let those banks support North Korea. We shouldn't be doing that.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Chang, if North Korea carries out any kind of provocations in October, would you interpret this as North Korea putting on a show of force before the U.S. election?
I think that's a good interpretation, largely because whoever is the next U.S. president is going to be of great importance to the Kim regime, and Kim may be trying to influence the outcome. But, we have seen North Korea surprise us. We have seen North Korea threaten to do something and not do it. But the point is, they're continuing to make progress, whether they test or not. And the United States needs to react to that, even if there are no overt tests.
So I agree with Gordon there. I also think that there's other purposes for missile testing, in addition to demonstrations of force. I think they are, mostly would be for research and development, for weapons testing, but also it could be meant as a signal to its internal audience for public celebrations like the celebration of the anniversary of the Workers' Party founding. But I don't think it would make any sense for North Korea to conduct a demonstration of force before the U.S. elections. One is because it would reflect poorly on President Trump, who has claimed that the nuclear threat is over. I think North Korea may want to see him continue because they want to see the personal diplomacy between the two leaders continue. I think it's more likely that North Korea conducts a provocation after the election so that they can create some additional leverage for renewed diplomacy, no matter who the new U.S. president is.
Mm. And South Korea's new defense minister, Seok, said North Korea is continuing to develop its missile capabilities. Are these missiles primarily aimed at South Korea or the United States? Mr. Han first.
Well, North Korea has a vast arsenal of ballistic missiles. They have the short range, medium range, intermediate range, and of course the intercontinental range ballistic missiles. And they're meant to deter a number of foreign threats, including the United States, but also South Korea, Japan, and maybe even China. Of course, I think the recent progress that's been made in terms of extending the range of North Korea's ballistic missiles to the intercontinental range is likely meant to deter a U.S. attack specifically.
Mr. Chang, let me ask you this. We can assume that the whole Korean peninsula is within North Korea's firing range. Mr. Chang, what would be the main targets within South Korea and how threatening would it be?
I think you can say the whole Republic of Korea, all of South Korea, is the main target. There would be a number of targets. I suspect that they are going to go after Seoul, which would be the obvious one. The question is whether they would, on an initial barrage, attack American forces, maybe hoping that we would bug out. We don't really know North Korea's doctrine, except we do know its goal. Its goal is to rule the entire Korean peninsula. So its military tactics may change from time to time, but we've got to keep in mind what its objective is.
Mr. Your thoughts?
Well, I agree, and I think there's a question of whether North Korea would target U.S. troops specifically. I think Pyeongtaek, Camp Humphreys, where there's been a consolidation of forces, that presents a juicy target. But again, North Korea needs to be careful about how significantly they want to escalate the situation. So there's a number of important targets in South Korea. The question is, what they want to target first.
Washington Post journalist Bob Woodward's new book was released this week. According to the book, Kim Jong-un didn't seem to mind the presence of the U.S. forces in South Korea, but felt threatened by the joint military exercises between the U.S. and South Korea. Why do you think that is the case? Mr. first.
Well, first of all, I think Kim Jong-un recognizes that the U.S.-South Korea joint military exercises are meant to train for many scenarios. And one of the situations is under an attack, the U.S. and South Korea could go into North Korea and take out the regime. Kim Jong-un is worried about that. He's also complained consistently about the deployment of U.S. strategic assets in military exercises like the strategic bombers and fighters, and how they could be used in potential decapitation missions. But he should also recognize that all militaries, including North Korea's, conduct exercises to maintain military readiness and deterrence. So if he wants to reduce risks, he should return to negotiations immediately. I also want to talk about U.S. troops. I think the fact that North Korea did not mention the removal of U.S. troops during recent negotiations is very important. We've seen over the last 30 years that North Korea has been equivocal, so they kind of waver about the issue of U.S. troop removal. Several times it's said in the past that they could serve potentially as a counterbalance to China, that U.S. troop presence is not an urgent matter. At other times, North Korea has brought up the issue of U.S. troop removal as a part of the agenda. It actually led to the collapse of the four-party peace talks in the late 1990s. And in recent years, North Korea has talked specifically about the removal of U.S. troops that have the authority over the use of nuclear weapons. So I think the bottom line is that as hard as it may be, we need to listen to what North Korea is saying instead of trying to interpret its intentions. So North Korea has asked for sanctions relief. They've asked for the end of military exercises. They've asked for the end of strategic and asset deployments to the peninsula. So we need to consider whether these are appropriate and realistic concessions and what the implications are for our security and for military readiness.
Well, North Korea, of course, wants the end of the exercises because that will erode readiness. And indeed, readiness has been eroded significantly. And we need to have a national conversation about this because we have 28,500 troops on the peninsula and their ability to deter a North Korean attack has been substantially reduced. Ultimately, the Kim regime wants the removal of U.S. troops from the peninsula, whether they press it in negotiations or not. And they know that that prevents the North Korean military from surging south and unifying the peninsula by force.
Mm-hmm. Woodward said in the book that the U.S. officials consider the use of nuclear weapons as a possible response to the North Korean attack. Do you think this is actually reviewed within the U.S. military, Mr. Chang?
I think that we plan for everything. Obviously, we don't want to use nuclear weapons first, but the United States has never had a no first use policy because our nukes are meant to deter those countries with superior military force. And for that, we should go back to the Cold War in Europe, where the use of nuclear weapons was contemplated because we realized that the Soviet forces were so much bigger than ours. In this Korean peninsula, the issues are not exactly the same, but North Korea does have a larger military. And I think that Moon Jae-in, the South Korean president, is eroding the ability of the South Korean forces to fight North Korea. So that makes the use of nuclear weapons more likely. But as I said, that is not something that we want to do. We have plans for everything, but that doesn't mean we want to use those weapons on the peninsula.
Well, first of all, I have to disagree with Gordon there in terms of South Korea eroding the forces and the capabilities of its military. South Korea has been increasing its defense budget over the last several years, and they've made a lot of investments in additional assets, including the acquisition of Global Hawk, the UAV, the acquisition of stealth fighters, and it's undergoing defense reform consistently. So regarding the question about the use of nuclear weapons, I agree with Gordon that the U.S. military plans for a full range of scenarios, and it certainly has plans to that entail the use of nuclear weapons against the North Korean attack. In fact, the U.S. has consistently stated that its extended deterrence commitments to defend South Korea include the use of nuclear capabilities. Now, whether that means the use of 1 or 5 or 80 nuclear weapons, I think that depends on the scenario. But I'd be very cautious about giving credence to a book's reporting about what I think is classified information.
Mm-hmm. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said that the talks between the U.S. and North Korea have gone quiet publicly, but there are efforts underway with the North Koreans to find an opportunity. Mr. Ahn, is this just a formality, or is there still a possibility of an October surprise in a way such as holding a meeting between the two countries?
Well, I wouldn't put too much weight on what Secretary Pompeo has said. If you read John Bolton's book, it seems to portray Secretary Pompeo as someone who, at least in public, likes to portray a very optimistic view of what could be considered a very difficult situation. I think there's always the possibility of a new development, including a quick agreement, but I think it's very unlikely. It wouldn't make sense for North Korea to reach a deal with the U.S. administration without knowing whether that administration will remain in power to implement that agreement. And then second, it takes a lot of effort and work to put these agreements and meetings together. It takes a lot of preparatory work for the substance, but even on the logistics of putting together a meeting, especially one at the leader level, that takes a lot of time too. So if a big meeting was going to happen, I think you would already start hearing from some press leaks about some of this happening already.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Chang, do you agree with this?
I don't think it makes political sense for President Trump to sign an agreement with North Korea. I think it would actually hurt him. And for all the reasons we've just heard, there's not going to be any North Korea surprise before the November 3 election.
According to China's state-operated media, CGTN, Chairman Kim Jong-un thanked the Chinese government for its congratulatory message on the country's 75th party founding anniversary. Mr. Chang, how would you assess the current status of China-North Korea relationship at a time when North Korea faces a lot of challenges?
I think that the relationship between Beijing and Pyongyang is the same today, really, as it's been for decades. When China really wants something from North Korea, the Kim regime always says yes. There's been a lot of talk about how the Chinese and the Koreans hate each other. And yeah, that's of course true. For centuries, these two states have been fighting each other. But at this particular time, I think North Korea realizes that it depends upon China for a lifeline on many items. And, we have seen, for instance, between the dynamic between Xi Jinping, the current Chinese ruler, and Kim Jong-un. Remember, Kim Jong-un went to Chinese soil 4 straight times before Xi Jinping went to Pyongyang. And I think that's a real indication of the balance of power relationship. Pyongyang may say all these horrible things about China. They may hate the Chinese, which I'm sure they do. But ultimately, Kim Jong-un knows that for the survival of his regime, he depends upon Beijing, and the nature of the relationship reflects that.
One of North Korea's largest events of the year, in which the North Korean regime could possibly stage a show of force, is set to take place next month. And the US election, which is being closely watched across the globe, follows within a month. The circumstances surrounding the Korean Peninsula and how they will develop will continue to draw our attention. Mr. and Mr. Chang, thank you both very much. I appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.